The galaxy had watched humanity bleed for 3 years before anyone thought to ask whether the bleeding was intentional. Commander Sarah Voss found out about the Vethkai ultimatum the same way she found out about most catastrophic diplomatic developments, standing barefoot on the cold deck of a patrol corvette, reading a second-hand transmission on a cracked tablet while someone else's coffee went cold behind her. The message was 12 words in Galactic Standard and 3 in something older. She read the 3 old words twice. Then she folded the tablet shut and looked out the forward viewport at the star field and stayed very still for a long time. Outside, the Kessler expanse drifted past in long banners of ionized gas, pale blues and ash greens, the color of bruises healing wrong. She'd always thought that about nebulae, that they looked like something that had taken a hit and was only just deciding whether it would survive. She poured the cold coffee down the recycler drain, made a fresh cup, drank half of it. Then she went to find her ship's only non-human crew member, a Drell navigator named Ashti, and asked him very calmly what the Vethkai phrase Vokena.sewer meant in older dialects, not the diplomatic translation, the real one. Ashti's 4 eye membranes cycled through their full rotation, the Drell, equivalent of a long, slow blink. "Commander," he said, in that careful way people use when they're about to say something that will change how you sleep at night. In older Vethkai, it means we have already begun. Sarah Voss nodded. She finished her coffee. She walked back to the command deck and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Right. The Vethkai Dominion was not the largest civilization in the known galaxy. That distinction belonged to the Conclave of Reth, a distributed civilization of photosynthetic hive minds spread across 47 star systems, who communicated through bioluminescent pulse chains and considered violence to be a processing error. The Vethkai were not the most technologically advanced, either. That distinction was contested between the Malar sovereignty and the ancient, mostly sleeping Keth-Dur, who had been building in deep space for so long that most of their constructions were now classified as geological features. What the Vethkai were was organized and patient, and absolutely convinced, to the bottom of their crystalline biocores, that the galaxy belonged to those with the discipline to hold it. They had been at war with humanity for 3 years, and in those 3 years they had taken 41 inhabited stations, 6 colony worlds, and a third of the outer reach. They had done it without a single ground battle. Their strategy was simple, elegant, and terrible. Cut the supply lines first, then the communication relays, then wait. Human populations, isolated and starving, surrendered without a shot. It was, from a purely operational standpoint, a masterwork of patient violence. The Vethkai Empress, her crystalline exactitude, Vethna the Unyielding, called it Kesadal, which translated loosely as the removal of reasons to continue. She was not, she told her admirals, trying to destroy humanity. She was trying to explain to humanity, in terms they could not misunderstand, that the outer reach belonged to the Dominion now, that the 17 colony worlds they had settled in the last 40 years were built on Vethkai navigational claims that predated humanity's first, faster-than-light jump by 6 centuries, that the proper response to this information was an orderly and dignified withdrawal, followed by reparations, followed by a period of respectful tributary status. The Empress was, in her own estimation, being very generous. She was giving them a way out that didn't involve mass graves. The humans had responded by not withdrawing. 3 years later, she was still waiting. This baffled her admirals. It baffled the representatives of the 7 species who sat on the Galactic Council's outer ring, who watched the slow-motion siege with the detached fascination of academics, observing an insect that had wandered into a very sophisticated trap. It baffled the Drell, who were old enough to have watched 7 civilizations reach this exact inflection point, and each time had simply folded. It even privately baffled the Malar Sovereignty's Strategic Intelligence Bureau, which had 17 different predictive models for how a species under total economic blockade would behave, and none of those models had a column for refuses to acknowledge that the blockade is working. The Galactic Council's senior observer, a Malar bureaucrat named Ikkel Voss, had been filing reports on the human situation for 31 months. His most recent report, transmitted 6 weeks before the ultimatum, contained 1 line that had been flagged, discussed, dismissed, flagged again, and was now the subject of a closed-session emergency committee. "I am no longer certain that the humans understand that they are losing." Sarah Voss had grown up on Callaway Station, a mid-size habitat in the outer third of the Kessler expanse that most cartographers included on maps only as a courtesy. It was the kind of place where the recycled air always had a faint metallic taste, where the artificial gravity was calibrated 0.03 G too low, because the station administrator had been managing a budget deficit for 11 consecutive years, and where children learned to tell the difference between a pressure seal failing and a thermal pipe groaning by the time they were 6. She had grown up knowing that the station could kill her in about 40 different ways, and that the appropriate response to this was to learn all 40 ways first. She had brown skin, dark eyes, and a burn scar along her left jaw that she had stopped explaining to new crew members because the explanation, "I was fixing a plasma coupling, I was 17, it was stupid," never seemed to satisfy them. Her hair was pulled back with a combination of a regulation band and a piece of wire. She had bent herself, because the regulation band alone never held when she was running. She had been running, metaphorically and occasionally literally, for 12 years in the United Earth Fleet, and she had arrived at the rank of commander not because she was especially political or especially ambitious, but because she had a specific quality that the fleet had learned, through costly experience, to promote. She was very good at understanding what was actually happening, as opposed to what the situation reports said was happening. The Vethkai had been very careful to describe their siege of humanity as a polite correction. What Sarah understood was that they were trying to wait out a species that, genetically and psychologically, did not experience waiting the same way other species did. This was the thing that Ikkel Voss had circled around in his report without ever quite landing on. Humans were not refusing to acknowledge the blockade because they were stupid, or proud, or pathologically optimistic. They were refusing to acknowledge the blockade because, at some deep neurochemical level, the experience of privation under pressure activated something in human physiology that was not present in any other known species. The Vethkai strategy was designed for beings whose nervous systems registered prolonged stress as a reason to stop. It had never encountered a species whose nervous systems registered prolonged stress as a reason to accelerate. The Council convened an emergency session at Crosspoint Station, which floated at the gravitational midpoint between 4 different star systems, and was for this reason considered neutral ground. It was a city the size of a small moon, and its central chamber, the Hall of Voices, could seat 10,000 representatives in person and relay to 100 times that number across the network. Today it held 43 of them. The mailer delegation sat behind their blue glass screens, 7 individuals in identical white wraps who moved in the precise synchronized manner of people who had been having the same internal conversation for centuries. The Drell clustered at one end of the curved floor, 11 of them membrane cycling at different speeds, which meant they were in the middle of a rapid exchange consensus discussion that looked, to non-Drell observers, like a group of very tall amphibians having a synchronized eye seizure. The conclave of Reth sent a single representative, which was, for them, a significant gesture. It meant they considered this important enough to dedicate an actual body to the discussion, rather than just routing bioluminescent feed. The Kethter sent no one, but 3 of the ceiling sensors had been recently modified in ways that hadn't been authorized. So the consensus was that they were observing. At the center of the floor, behind a single plane table, sat 2 humans. Captain Admiral Jonas Mrak was 61 years old and looked it. He had the kind of face that had been through enough that it had stopped bothering to be expressive about the small things. He was in full fleet dress, navy blue, gold trim, 4 rows of service medals that most species present couldn't read, but that any human could have spent an hour decoding. Beside him, 3 ranks below him in official structure, but clearly the one he deferred to when it mattered, was Commander Sarah Voss, who was wearing a field jacket over her dress uniform. Because the Hall of Voices ran cold and she had bad circulation in her left hand since a boarding action 2 years ago, across from them on the curved elevated platform reserved for primary parties sat Vethna the Unyielding. The Empress of the Vethkai Dominion was not what most species imagined when they pictured a conqueror. She was small by Vethkai standards, barely 2 meters tall, built along the same general crystalline organic lines as all her people, with a bioluminescent lattice beneath her outer carapace that pulsed in slow waves of amber and violet when she spoke. Her eyes were 8-fold and compound, and they did not blink. She had been ruling for 117 years, and she wore it the way mountains wore weather, without any particular acknowledgement that it was happening. She was flanked by 2 advisors and, to the right, somewhat lower, by her daughter, Princess Vethli, the inheritor who had been sent to observe the council session as part of her education in Dominion diplomacy. Vethli was 23 years old in Vethkai terms, which made her roughly equivalent to a very serious and very determined 14-year-old human in terms of developmental stage. But her eyes had the compound multi-layer focus of someone who was watching everything at once and processing most of it. She had the same amber-violet lattice as her mother, but hers flickered when something surprised her, which it had been doing fairly steadily since the humans walked into the room. They didn't move right. That was the first thing Vethli noticed. Vethkai moved in precise arcs and curves. Drell moved in the slow, deliberate way of creatures that had evolved in zero-gravity ocean basins. The Mailer moved like they were conserving energy for something important. Humans moved like... She searched her studies for the right frame, like they were making it up as they went. The older human, the Admiral, moved with a kind of settled heaviness that she recognized from the combat records she'd studied. The younger one, the Commander, moved like there was always a second option she was already calculating. Neither of them looked afraid. Vethli had attended 14 council sessions. Every delegation that had ever sat across from her mother at that table had registered physiological signals of stress. She had learned to read them: the Drell membrane flutter, the Mailer posture compression, the faint bioluminescent pulse suppression of the Reth representative. Even delegations who were technically winning whatever dispute they'd come to, resolve showed fear in the presence of the Empress. It was appropriate. It was the correct response to power. These 2 humans were sitting with the relaxed, focused alertness of people who had scheduled a meeting and showed up to have it. Vethli logged this. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she logged it. The Empress spoke first. She always spoke first. It was not protocol. It was simply the reality that no one else in any room she entered ever had the specific quality of stillness that could occupy silence before she was ready to release it. The ultimatum was clear, she said. The translation matrix in the hall's ceiling converted her voice into galactic standard, with the slight resonant delay that compound language speech required. Humanity will withdraw from the contested outer reach systems within 90 standard days. Reparations for the use of 6 centuries of claimed navigational lanes will be calculated and agreed upon. The blockade ends upon the first withdrawal. The Dominion is prepared to be generous with the terms of tributary status. She let that settle. Humanity's response, said Admiral Mrak, is no. The Mailer delegation did a synchronized inhale that they probably thought was subtle. The Drell membrane rates shifted up across the board. Vethli's lattice flickered. The Empress was quiet for a moment. The Dominion has taken 41 of your stations, 6 of your worlds, a third of your outer territories. You are under full economic blockade. Your colonies are isolated. Your supply chains are severed. Your military has fought 3 years of defensive actions and taken 3 years of losses. She paused. Is it possible that your delegation misunderstands the nature of your position? Our position, said Sarah Voss, speaking for the first time, is exactly what it looks like. She had a voice that was unremarkable in the way that load-bearing walls are. Unremarkable, quiet, flat, structural. You're asking us to give up 17 colony worlds that 300 million humans call home. We're telling you we're not going to do that. The lives of 300 million are weighed against the lives of 3 trillion, the Empress said. The math is not complex. The math is fine, Voss said. The assumption that 300 million is the relevant number is where it goes wrong. The Empress's lattice pulsed amber. She was not, Vethli recognized, angry. She was doing what she always did when a conversation became interesting, slowing down. Explain. You're assuming, Voss said, that the only humans who have a stake in this are the ones living in the outer reach. That's approximately 300 million people who are willing to fight. But that's not actually the relevant number, because what you did when you blockaded them wasn't isolate them. It was make every other human in the settled systems personally aware that people they know, cousins, old colleagues, people they went to school with on stations like the ones you took, are being starved and blockaded on your orders. She put her hands flat on the table. She had a scar on the left one, Vethli noticed, and she didn't favor it. The relevant number is 18 billion. That's how many humans are currently aware of someone they personally care about in the outer reach. And I want to be very specific about what caring means for humans physiologically, because I think it's going to matter to this conversation. The Empress waited. Humans, Voss said, have a neurological response to threat against people they're attached to that is distinct from the response to personal threat. Personal threat activates survival calculus, self-preservation reasoning. Threat to attachment figures activates something older, something that does not calculate survival well. It activates, in our older literature, what our soldiers used to call going to the dark place. It is the state in which a human stops asking whether they can win and starts asking only how much damage they can do before they stop. She paused. The Vethkai strategy was designed to make us too tired, too hungry, and too beaten to continue. We've been watching you do it for 3 years, and I want you to understand something very clearly. She looked directly at the Empress. Not the way you look at a superior, Vethley thought, but the way you look at someone when you need them to understand exactly what you are saying. You haven't made us tired. You've made us angry, and there is a difference. The hall was very quiet. Ikkel Voss in the mailer gallery made a small note on his datapad. He underlined it twice. After the session, Vethley found her way to one of the observation galleries that overlooked the hall from above, where the air recycled faster and the bioluminescent guidelines on the floor were dimmer, a semi-private space. She was surprised to find the human commander there already, standing at the viewport with a cup of something hot, looking at the starfield. The commander turned when she heard Vethley's approach. Her eyes, the flat, forward-facing, non-compound human eyes that should have provided terrible peripheral awareness but somehow didn't, located Vethley in about 2/3 of a second. She didn't look startled. "Princess," she said, which was the correct honorific for informal address. "Commander," said Vethley. She stopped a polite distance away. "I wanted to observe you more closely. I hope that is not offensive." "I've been observed more closely," Voss said. She turned back to the viewport. "Your mother's going to push back." "Yes. She's going to say that the emotional response I described is a strategic liability, not an asset. That a civilization willing to fight past rational self-interest is inherently unstable and will collapse internally faster than any external pressure could achieve." "Yes," said Vethley again. "That is, I believe, her current analysis." Voss nodded slowly, lifted the cup. "She's probably studied our history extensively. She found the wars, the collapses, the dark centuries." "Yes." "Did she find the parts where we came back?" Vethley's lattice flickered. Every time, Voss said, without exception. Plague, war, collapse, environmental catastrophe. We have a word for it in the oldest languages. Resilience. It's not bragging. It's just the thing that happens when you spend 1,000,000 years evolving on a planet that was actively trying to kill you. Vethley processed this. Your world, Earth, I studied it. It is classified at Tier 6 biological hazard. I reviewed the atmospheric composition, the temperature variance, the predator density in your baseline evolutionary period. The what we evolved in, Voss said. Yeah, the study identified 14 separate extinction-level events that humanity survived during your developmental period. Before space travel. 15, Voss said. The survey missed a regional one in what we call the Younger Dryas. Took us down to maybe 10,000 individuals. 10,000, Vethley said. Her lattice was doing something it rarely did. A full-spectrum flicker amber-violet cycling rapidly, the Vethkai equivalent of a mind reorganizing itself around new information. From 10,000, 8 billion. At the time your Empress's ancestors were filing their navigational claims. Voss looked at her. And then 18 billion. And we're still going. She put the cup down. We're not suicidal. We're not crazy. We just come from a place where the lesson you learn, if you survive long enough to learn it, is that giving up is the only thing that actually kills you. Vethley was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "May I ask you something personal?" Voss gestured with one hand. "Go ahead. Are you afraid right now?" The commander looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled. And it was a strange thing, Vethley thought. A smile. This small involuntary rearrangement of face muscles, this signal that existed in no other species she had studied. This tiny bright flag that humans raised in the dark. "Yeah," Voss said, "pretty scared. But you don't show it. Showing it doesn't help. The fear doesn't go anywhere. You just work with it." She picked up her cup again. "That's another thing your mother's analysis probably missed. We're not fearless. We're terrified most of the time. We just have a long history of being terrified and doing the thing anyway." The Empress gave them 30 days to reconsider. 30 days in Galactic Standard Time was a generous gesture. The Vethkai negotiating tradition called for 7, and it was intended to communicate that the Dominion was not unreasonable. It was intended to give the human delegation time to go home and explain to their government the full extent of what they were facing and what could still be avoided. Sarah Voss spent the 30 days doing 3 things: sleeping 4 hours a night, working 16 hours a day on what she referred to in official documents as contingency planning, and, in the 4 hours between, teaching herself the 3 words of Old Vethkai that the ultimatum had included, and what they meant in context, and why the Empress had chosen to end a diplomatic document with a phrase that predated the current dominion by 400 years. Vokena dat sur. We have already begun. The phrase was from the Vethkai's own foundational history, the Reclamation period, when their species had unified its fractured city-states under the first Empress by a combination of military force and a doctrine called Kesavel. The belief that the most important moment in any conflict was not when hostilities started, but when the dominant party privately decided on the outcome. We have already begun was the phrase the first Empress had used when informing a defeated rival state that the war was already decided. She hadn't sent it at the opening of conflict. She'd sent it at the end, after the outcome was settled in her mind but before a single soldier had moved. The Empress was not announcing a new offensive. She was announcing that, in her own analysis, the war was already decided. Sarah Voss read this and turned it over and spent several days thinking about what it meant that a ruler of extraordinary strategic intelligence had decided, after 3 years of a siege that should have worked, that the outcome was already certain. And then she understood. The siege hadn't been designed to break humanity. It had been designed to break humanity publicly, in front of the entire Galactic Council, so that the strategic lesson was unmistakable. This is what happens to species that challenge the Dominion. This is the patience. This is the reach. This is the inevitability. The siege was never just about the outer reach. It was a demonstration for 17 other smaller species who were watching very carefully and calculating whether their own territorial ambitions needed reassessing. The Empress was right that it had worked. 7 of the 17 had, in the past 18 months, quietly backed away from disputes with Dominion adjacent as territories. 3 more had initiated tributary inquiries. The siege of humanity was, strategically, a tremendous success. Except that the lesson it was supposed to teach was, don't challenge the Dominion. And the lesson humanity was teaching, every day that the siege continued and humans kept fighting, was something else entirely. The lesson humanity was teaching was, it doesn't work on everyone. Sarah Voss, in the last hour of the 29th day, sent Admiral Mrak a message that contained 3 words, not Vethkai, just, I have it. She presented the plan to the full council on the 30th day, 6 hours before the deadline. It was not, she acknowledged at the beginning, a conventional military proposal. The United Earth Fleet did not have the firepower to break the Vethkai blockade by direct engagement. The blockade involved 114 Dominion warships, including 6 capital vessels of the Crystalline class, each one roughly twice the displacement of the largest human ship in active service. A direct assault would result in a defeat that would be total, swift, and exactly what the Empress had been waiting for. That was not the plan. The plan was something that, she said, required the Council to understand 2 things about human military tradition that were not well documented in standard xenosociological texts. The first thing was the concept of combined arms, the practice of deploying different types of force so that each covered the weaknesses of the others. Vethkai military doctrine, she noted, was exceptionally sophisticated in this regard. Their fleet formations were coordinated to a level that required the Dominion's collective combat intelligence network to manage in real time, a distributed AI-assisted tactical system that was, frankly, better than anything the fleet had built. There was no point pretending otherwise. The second thing was the concept of what human military historians called the indirect approach. The principle, documented in human strategic literature going back 4,000 years, that a direct assault against a superior force's strength was always less effective than a strike against the thing the force existed to protect. You did not attack a wall. You went around the wall and burned the city. The Vethkai blockade was a wall. It was not the city. The city was the collective intelligence network that managed the blockade's real-time coordination. Without that network, the 114 Vethkai ships became 114 independent captains operating on last known orders with no coordination. Individually, Each of those ships was still more powerful than most fleet vessels. But without coordination, the formation opened gaps. Without coordination, a fleet that had been optimized for a siege became vulnerable to the one type of warfare it had never been designed for: chaos. Humans, Sarah Voss said to the 43 representatives in the Hall of Voices, and specifically to the Empress sitting 8 meters away from her, are not optimized for order. We evolved in chaos. We train in chaos. Our military history, which goes back longer and contains more conflicts than any other spacefaring species of our developmental age, is largely a record of how to fight when nothing is working the way it's supposed to. Our doctrine does not assume functioning logistics. It does not assume communication continuity. It does not assume formation integrity. Our doctrine assumes that everything will go wrong and plans for how to keep fighting when it has. She pulled up a holographic display. 114 blue markers, the blockade fleet, and then, threading between them, a series of small red lines, so thin they were almost invisible. These are the paths that don't exist. The navigational corridors that are not officially mapped because they run through 3 debris fields, a radiation band, and the outer edge of a gravity lensing event that makes long-range targeting unreliable. Paths that any rational fleet planner would mark as impassable. She paused. We've been running supply runs through 2 of them for 8 months, keeping the outer reach fed and armed while you were convinced the blockade was working. The hall was silent. The blockade hasn't been working, she said quietly. We just let you think it was, so you'd keep the fleet in position long enough for us to finish what we needed to finish. On the holographic display, the red lines began to move, and as they moved, Vethley, watching with every one of her compound eye facets, understood for the first time what she had been watching for 3 years. Not a civilization being slowly strangled. A civilization that had taken a hit and was deciding, in the exact way the commander had described, whether it would survive. It had decided it would survive. The Battle of the Kessler Expanse, as it was later catalogued by the Galactic Council's Historical Bureau, lasted 11 hours and 23 minutes. It was the first major engagement of the Outer Reach War to end without a clear tactical winner. It was also, every analyst noted, the first major engagement in the 3-year conflict in which the United Earth Fleet had initiated action rather than responded. Commander Sarah Voss commanded the 7th Rapid Response Group from the bridge of her corvette, the Meridian Fault, a ship named after a geological feature on a planet she had been to exactly once. She had chosen the name when she took command of the ship because she liked what it implied. A line of fracture in the earth that had been there longer than anyone could remember, too deep to repair. Just a fact of the landscape that you built around and worked with. She thought that was a reasonably accurate description of herself. The 7th was not the fleet's largest formation. It was 22 ships, a mix of corvettes, 2 light cruisers, and a single Frontier-class destroyer that was 3 years past its scheduled refit and held together, as its chief engineer put it, with optimism and a specific brand of epoxy that they don't make anymore. It did not have the firepower to go toe-to-toe with the Vethkai capital vessels. That was not what it was for. It was for the gaps. The first phase of the engagement went, as Voss had told the Council it would, through the paths that didn't exist. The debris field at the inner edge of the Kessler Expanse had a corridor roughly 400 meters wide, where the density dropped enough for a ship, with a competent helmsman to thread through at approximately 40% conventional engagement speed. It was terrifying to fly. Voss had done the simulation run 63 times and had found it terrifying every single time. The key insight was that terrifying and impossible were different categories, and human pilots had been blurring that line for as long as they had been in space. All 22 ships made it through. They lost 2 sensor arrays and a communications booster that got clipped by a tumbling fragment the size of a cargo container. The booster had been scheduled to be replaced in next month's refit cycle anyway. The second phase was the strike on the collective intelligence nodes, the relay stations that connected the Dominion's 114 ships into a single coordinated tactical organism. There were 7 primary nodes and 11 secondary backups positioned at the strategic vertices of the blockade formation. Voss had spent 4 months working out which 7 of the 11 backup nodes, if destroyed in sequence, would create a cascading failure in the primary network rather than triggering a failover to isolated operation. It was the kind of problem that a very specific type of mind found interesting, not the here is a wall, apply force type of mind, But the here is a system. Find the points where a small change produces a large result type. Voss had always been the second type. The seventh hit the nodes in 9 minutes. They lost 3 ships, the Hayden, the Cortez, and the Corvette, Unbroken, which had been Voss's first posting as an ensign 14 years ago. She registered the loss of the Unbroken as a physical event, a small precise hurt that she noted and set aside, because she was going to be doing a lot of noting and setting aside in the next hour, and there wasn't time for anything else. The Veth Kai fleet's coordination network fractured on schedule. Not completely. The Dominion's military engineers were exceptional and the failover protocols were better than Voss had hoped for. But enough. Enough that the formation opened 3 gaps. Enough that the 114 ships that had been one organism became clusters, then became individuals, then became a fleet trying to communicate on bandwidth that had been halved and corrupted. Phase 3 was the frontier destroyer, Ironclad Meridian. The older ship that should not have still been operational, crewed by 81 people who had volunteered specifically for this, going straight down the center gap at full combat speed with every weapon it had firing. Not because it could win that engagement, because when a single human ship charged through a gap in a Veth Kai capital vessel formation firing everything in its magazines, every ship in that formation had to decide what to do about it. And when 114 ships, suddenly lacking coordination, all had to independently decide what to do about the same unexpected threat, they did not all decide the same thing. 6 of them moved to intercept, 4 held position, 2 accelerated to fire. The rest did a dozen different things that were individually correct but collectively disastrous. Because the thing that made the Veth Kai fleet a fleet rather than 114 warships was the network, and the network was gone. Ironclad Meridian lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Its crew survived because Voss had insisted, over the objections of every strategic planning officer who reviewed the plan, on routing the evacuation pods through the debris field corridors that the Veth Kai wouldn't have mapped. 78 of the 81 crew were recovered. The other 3, Chief Engineer Dawit Abebe, Weapons Officer Lieutenant Kara Shu, and a rating whose name was Anders Blom, who had been fixing a seal in the aft section and hadn't made it to a pod, were not. Voss had known Abebe. She had not known Shu or Blom, but she had read their files 3 days before the engagement, as she read the files of everyone whose lives she was about to bet on her own planning, because she had learned somewhere early in her career that you should know who you were risking. She noted their names. She set them aside. She kept working. The engagement ended not with a dramatic final shot or a surrender signal, but with something quieter. The Veth Kai admiral commanding the blockade fleet, a veteran named Vethos the Certain, ordering a full withdrawal to the outer formation edge and requesting a communication channel to the council. He was given the channel. He said, in the flat, precise language of a military officer filing an after-action report, the tactical situation in the Kessler Expanse has been significantly altered by human action. This command requests updated instructions from the Empress. He did not say the blockade had failed. He did not say the humans had won. He was a professional, and professionals did not say things like that. But the request was itself the information. The Veth Kai admiral who had held this formation for 3 years without a single escalation in instructions was requesting updated instructions, which meant the situation he had been instructed to manage no longer existed in the form it had been described to him. The Empress received the report. She was alone in her chamber when she read it, which was unusual. She sat in the stillness for what her advisors later described as an unusually long period. Her lattice, they noted from the monitoring feeds, pulsed in a pattern that none of them had seen before. Not the slow amber waves of calm assessment, not the rapid violet of rapid decision-making, something in between. The Veth Kai had a word for this pattern from their deep history used only in specific contexts. Verkesa. It translated imprecisely as reassessment of a fundamental assumption. She called her daughter. Vethli arrived in the Empress's chamber and stood, as was custom, 3 paces back from the main console until invited forward. The Empress did not speak immediately. She was looking at a display that showed the Kessler Expanse formation, the blue markers scattered now, regrouping at a new edge, the 3 gaps visible like breaks in a line of text. You spoke with the human commander, the Empress said. Yes, Mother. Tell me what you observed. Bethany considered. This was not a question about facts. Her mother had access to all the same facts. This was a question about interpretation, about the specific judgment that came from proximity. She was afraid, Bethany said, and she was working, not despite the fear. With it, I have been trying to find an equivalent in our history, and I cannot. The Empress nodded slowly. She described their evolution, Bethany continued. A world that was Tier 6 hazard, an extinction event that reduced them to 10,000 individuals. I have been thinking about what kind of species comes back from 10,000 individuals to 18 billion. She paused. I think I made a foundational error in my studies, Mother. I was analyzing humanity the way I would analyze any young species, looking at their developmental markers, their expansion rate, their technological curve. But those are the things you look at to understand a species' ceiling. I was not looking for the thing that tells you their floor. Their floor, the Empress said, the minimum from which they can rebuild. Every species has a theoretical floor, the point below which they cannot sustain civilization. I was assuming because humanity is young that their floor is relatively high. I was wrong. Based on what I observed and what I have read since, Bethany's lattice pulsed through a full spectrum, amber to violet and back. Their floor may be the lowest of any known spacefaring civilization, and their distance between floor and ceiling is correspondingly enormous. The Empress was quiet. The blockade strategy, Bethany said, more carefully, was designed for a species with a high floor. Deprive them enough, and they reach the point of unsustainable collapse. But if the floor is as low as the evidence suggests, then there is no deprivation sufficient to trigger that collapse, because the species does not have the neurological response that produces it. They do not experience enough to collapse the same way we do. They experience it as, she searched for the right word, as a calibration. The Empress turned to look at her daughter. You are saying the strategy cannot work. I am saying the strategy cannot work the way it was designed. What it achieved, the reduction of their outer territories, the isolation of their colonies, it achieved. But the intended final effect, the recognition of defeat and the orderly withdrawal, cannot be produced by this method, because the method depends on a physiological response that they do not have. Then we apply more pressure. More pressure, Bethany said, produces more of the same response. She stopped. She was aware she was about to say something that had never been said to her mother in 117 years of rule. She said it anyway, because she was 23 years old and had just watched a single human corvette thread a debris field that should have been impassable, and then watched its crew come home in pods through corridors that didn't appear on any map. We were wrong about them. The Empress's lattice stilled. I do not say this as criticism of the strategy, Bethany said quickly. The intelligence was consistent with every available model. But they are not consistent with any available model. They are something that our models were not built to predict because our models were not built to account for a species that was shaped by conditions we have no analog for. She looked at her mother steadily. We have been fighting them for 3 years. We have taken everything the strategy specified, and they are still here, and they just told us, at the council, and in the Kessler Expanse, in the same 30 days, that they have been here the whole time, and that the 3 years was preparation, not endurance. She paused. That is not a species in retreat. That is a species that just introduced itself. It took 6 days for the Empress to reach the decision that Bethany had been watching her circle since the engagement. It was not that the Empress was slow. She was anything but slow. It was that a decision of this kind required the same comprehensive reassessment that a military restructuring required. You didn't just change the tactic. You identified every other conclusion that had been built on the same assumption, and you checked them all. On the 7th day, the Empress sent a message to Crosspoint Station, requesting a private session with the 2 members of the United Earth delegation. The session lasted 4 hours. No recording was made, by mutual agreement. What came out of it 6 days after that was the first joint statement ever issued by the Vethkai Dominion and the United Earth Territorial Authority. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph acknowledged that the disputed outer reach systems had been occupied by human settlers for a period sufficient, under Galactic Council precedent, to constitute a claim of settlement. The second paragraph established a joint commission to determine the precise boundaries of Vethkai navigational claims and human settlement claims, with a council-appointed mediator. The third paragraph ended the blockade, immediately and completely, with reparations. from the Dominion to the human colonies, not the reverse, to be calculated by the same commission. Admiral Mrack read the statement twice. He was a man who had learned to be suspicious of good news, and he spent 15 minutes examining the 3 paragraphs for the clause he had missed. He didn't find one. He passed the statement to Voss without comment. Voss read it once. She handed it back. "How long before the commission work is done?" she asked. "Years," the Admiral said. "Years is fine." She leaned back in her chair. "Years is good, actually. On Callaway Station in the Kessler Expanse, on 6 colony worlds that had been under blockade for 3 years. And we're now receiving the first unrestricted supply convoy in 37 months. People did the things people do when a long, hard thing ends. Some of them cried, some of them didn't. Some of them ate a meal that was better than anything they'd eaten in 3 years and didn't say anything about it. Some of them called people they hadn't been able to reach reliably and said the kinds of things that get said in the first minutes of reconnection. Not dramatic things, just, "Are you okay? Yes. Are you okay? Yes, we're okay." On the Meridian Fault. Voss sat in the command chair after her crew had gone off shift and drank a cup of coffee that was better than usual, because the supply convoy had brought fresh grounds from Earth, actual Earth, the real one, from a region that grew a specific kind of bean in volcanic soil, and sold it to the fleet at a price that was, as the quartermaster had put it, criminal but worth it. She drank it slowly. She thought about the Euro unbroken, and about Dawit Abebe, and about the specific way the debris field at the inner Kessler edge looked when you were threading through it at 40% speed with your teeth together and your hands absolutely steady on the controls. She thought about Vethli, the young Vethkai princess who had sat in an observation gallery, and asked her, with 8 compound eyes and a bioluminescent lattice and the genuine curiosity of a very good mind encountering a new thing, "Are you afraid?" "Yeah," Voss thought. "Pretty scared. We just keep going anyway." That was the thing no model accounted for. Not the tactics, not the biology, not the history. The thing no model accounted for was the specific texture of what it felt like to come from a place that had killed you 10,000 times and had not managed, not once in a million years, to make you think the right response was to lie down and let it. She had a term for it, from an old Earth language that she had studied because it came from the same general region as her grandmother's family, and she had wanted to understand something about where she came from. The word was saber, a concept that translated imprecisely as patient endurance, but which she had learned, reading the older texts, meant something more specific. Not the passive endurance of something waiting to be over, but the active, deliberate, clear-eyed choice to continue, to absorb the blow, to assess the damage, and to keep standing, not because you didn't feel it, because you had already decided that feeling it was not a reason to stop. The Galactic Council's final report on the Outer Reach War, filed 18 months after the armistice, ran to approximately 200,000 words in Galactic Standard. It was studied extensively at every major military and diplomatic academy in the known galaxy for the next several decades. Most of the study focused on the tactical innovations, the debris field corridors, the network disruption strategy, the doctrine of deliberate formation chaos. These were genuinely interesting and genuinely teachable, and became part of the standard curriculum for advanced strategic studies across 12 species military academies within a generation. But the section of the report that Vethli, who became Empress 17 years later and served for 83 years after that, ordered reprinted and distributed to every school in the Dominion, was not the tactical analysis. It was a 6-paragraph addendum written by the Council observer Ikkel Voss, who had been watching humans for 3 years from the Malheur Gallery, and who was, by the end of it, one of the galaxy's foremost specialists in human behavior. The addendum began. Analysts have persistently mischaracterized the key distinguishing feature of human capability as their biology, or their tactical creativity, or their specific relationship to fear. These features are real, but they are not foundational. The foundational feature, from which all others derive, is something for which most galactic languages do not have a precise word. It is the capacity to simultaneously understand, completely and without illusion, how bad their situation is, and to treat that understanding as information rather than instruction. He went on, most species, when presented with an accurate assessment of overwhelming odds, experience the assessment as a directive. The odds are too high. The assessment says stop. Humans experience the same assessment as data. The odds are high. How does that change what I do next? The distinction sounds small. It is not small. It is the difference between a civilization that could be brought to the edge of extinction 10,000 times and fold, and a civilization that could be brought to the edge of extinction 10,000 times and use each instance as a lesson. He concluded, I have spent 3 years trying to find the word, in any language I know, for a species that meets the worst thing that has ever happened to it and responds, not with denial and not with despair, but with, right, now what? I have not found the word. Perhaps it does not exist because until now no species required it. I would suggest that every diplomatic and military institution in the known galaxy begin developing one. The station cafeteria on Calloway was small and perpetually understaffed, and the air still had its slight metallic taste, and the gravity was still calibrated 0.03 G too low because the budget deficit that had existed when Sarah Voss was a child was only slightly smaller now. But the lights were on, and the supply convoy had stocked the freezers, and there were children running across the deck plates, the way children run, when they have recently been given something they were worried they might not get back. Voss had not planned to stop on Calloway. Meridian Fault was routing through the expanse on a survey mission. The new commission required updated navigational mapping, and the fleet was providing survey vessels. She had routed it, she would have told you, purely for logistical efficiency. She sat in the cafeteria for an hour. She drank 2 cups of coffee. She watched the children. She thought about nothing in particular. A woman at the adjacent table asked her if she was military, and she said yes. And the woman said her brother was on one of the stations that had been under blockade, and he was okay. And Voss said she was glad. They didn't say anything after that. They just sat in the same space for a little while, which is a human thing, the capacity to be present with someone in a quiet moment and let that be enough. When she left, she stopped at the door and looked back at the cafeteria. The bad lighting, the children, the slightly too light gravity, the woman at the table looking out through the viewport at the pale blue and ash-green banners of the Kessler Expanse. Like bruises, Voss thought, like something that got hit and was deciding whether it would survive. It had decided. She walked back to her ship. She had maps to make. 19 years later, when Commander Sarah Voss, Admiral by then, 7 years into a posting at the Council's newly established Interspecies Conflict Resolution Agency, the organization that the post-war diplomatic community had agreed, after considerable wrangling, was necessary because humanity had proved that there were things that could not be resolved by either ignoring them or by very patient siege. The commencement address to the first class of mixed-species military cadets at the Joint Academy on Cross Point Station, she said something that was later included in the official record and printed in 4,000 pamphlets that circulated across the known galaxy and were translated into 31 languages. She said, there is a question that every culture in this room has a version of. It comes up in your philosophy, your religion, your folklore, your strategic doctrine. The question is, what do you do when you face something that you cannot beat? She let it sit. Most of the answers your cultures have produced fall into one of 2 categories. Some say, you accept the thing. You find peace with the loss. You adapt, you survive by changing. This is wisdom. Some say, you fight the thing, regardless of the cost. You go down fighting if you must, but you go down on your feet. This is also wisdom. She looked out at the faces, Vethkai, Drell, Malir, Reth, human, and 6 other species she had come to know over 19 years of sitting at the same tables with them. Humans have a third answer, not instead of those 2. In addition, she put her hands flat on the podium. Same gesture as 20 years ago at the same table, in the Hall of Voices. The third answer is, you get curious. You look at the thing you can't beat, and instead of asking, can I survive this, or how do I accept this, you ask, why is this the shape it is? What is this thing made of? What does it need? Where are its gaps? You turn fear into investigation. You turn despair into engineering. You don't do this because you're especially brave. You do it because, for whatever reason, your species landed on a planet that required this of you before it would let you stay. She paused. We are not the most powerful species in this room. We are not the oldest. We may not be the wisest. But we have been doing this longer than we have been doing anything else. And I believe the next century of this council, of this galaxy, will be better for having a species at the table that does not know how to understand impossible as anything other than a current working theory. She stepped back from the podium. She said one more thing very quietly, almost as an aside. Also, we make good coffee. Once the supply lines are working. There was a pause. And then laughter, not just from the human cadets, but from Vethley's daughter, who was in the third row, and from the Drell representative who had come to observe, and from the Malir instructors, and from a Keth-Dur observer whom no one had quite confirmed was in the building at all. Laughter. Eightfold compound eyes and bioluminescent lattices and membrane-ringed pupils and flat brown human eyes, all in the same room, all making the same sound. It was a small thing. It was a very human thing, Voss thought. The specific insistence that even at the edge of the most important speech you might ever give, even at the summit of everything you had worked toward, you left room for the small, bright, unguarded moment. The half-smile in the dark. The cup passed around before the fight. She gathered her notes. She had a meeting in an hour. She was not afraid. She was not unafraid. She was, as she had always been, both things at once. The fear and the work, the damage and the decision to continue. And somewhere between those two things, doing what she had always done. Finding the path that didn't appear on any map, and flying it anyway. The Joint Commission met for the first time 11 weeks after the armistice. In a neutral chamber on Crosspoint Station that smelled like recycled air and old arguments. Sarah Voss was not officially part of the commission. She was fleet, not diplomatic, but Admiral Mrack had appointed her as a technical observer, with advisory status, which was the institutional equivalent of quietly putting the person who actually understood the situation in the room while maintaining the fiction that the diplomats were running it. She sat in the second row. She took notes. She did not speak unless asked. When asked, she was precise. The Vethkai delegation was led by a senior administrator named Vethos the Methodical. No relation to the admiral, just a common Vethkai naming convention, who was approximately 200 years old and had been involved in 17 previous boundary negotiations. He had a reputation for being absolutely impossible to rattle and for never conceding a point without extracting an equal concession in exchange. He reminded Voss of several people she had known in her life, including her station administrator on Callaway, who had managed a budget deficit for 11 consecutive years by the sheer accumulated force of not accepting that it was permanent. Across from him sat Earth's chief negotiator, a woman named Commissioner Ama Adjei, who had spent 40 years in diplomatic service and who spoke 7 languages, including improbably conversational Vethkai. She had learned it specifically for this negotiation. Vethos the Methodical had registered this during the first session and had, for the first time in his documented career, asked for a 15-minute recess to consult with his staff. When he came back, he had been slightly more careful. It is the specificity of the preparation that unnerves them, Voss told Voss during one of the breaks, speaking in the comfortable shorthand they had developed over years of sitting in the same rooms, watching the same negotiations. He was technically retired from active council observation, but attended the commission sessions as a courtesy and consultant. He had brought his own tea. It is not the learning of the language itself that is impressive but comprehensible. It is the duration. She spent 40 years in diplomatic service before being appointed. She did not learn Vethkai in anticipation of this specific negotiation. She learned it in anticipation of a negotiation like this, at some unspecified future point. The investment precedes the necessity by years. Long planning horizon, Voss said. For a species theoretically characterized by emotional impulsiveness, he sipped his tea. Your xenosociological profile in Dominion literature emphasizes instability, short-term reasoning, reactive behavior. It does not account for the simultaneous existence of the planning horizon. Both exist in the same individuals. I have a new theory. What's the theory? That humans are not less emotional than other species, he said, but more able to contextualize emotion temporally. You feel the thing in the present and act on it in the present, but you also feel the thing from the perspective of a future self looking back. You can be angry and simultaneously be the person who will, in 10 years, understand why the anger was useful. You are not ruled by your emotions. You are in an ongoing negotiation with them. He set down his tea, which is, I think, the thing that most other species find impossible to model. We look at your history and see contradiction. Fierce and patient, impulsive and disciplined, devastatingly short-sighted and extraordinarily far-sighted. But it is not contradiction. It is a single cognitive architecture that holds more registers at once than our models assumed. Voss considered this for a while. That's a generous read. I am a generous person. We also just argue a lot and make bad decisions, yes. But you argue a lot and make bad decisions while simultaneously keeping records so that the next generation can learn from the bad decisions. He raised an eyebrow. The malar equivalent was a subtle shift in the brow ridge. No other species of your developmental age has anything equivalent to your historical archive density. You document everything, including the failures, especially the failures. This is, I believe, why your floor is so low, because the information required to rebuild from catastrophe is preserved and accessible. You cannot destroy the knowledge with the civilization because you have distributed the knowledge too widely to eliminate. The commission session bell rang. They went back in. The boundary negotiations took 4 years, 14 months, and 9 days to produce a binding agreement. It was not a good agreement in the sense that neither side was completely satisfied with it, which was, all things considered, the definition of a good agreement. The Vethkai retained sovereignty over 3 of the 6 major navigational claim zones and received a structured reparations payment from the United Earth Territorial Authority for commercial traffic through those zones over the previous 40 years. Humanity retained full sovereignty over all 17 contested colony worlds, with access agreements for Dominion scientific and commercial vessels, and received a structured reparations payment from the Dominion for the 3-year blockade and the economic damage to the outer reach. The net financial flows, when calculated, came out almost exactly even. The council observers noted this with considerable amusement. The Vethkai chief administrator did not appear amused. Commissioner Ajay appeared entirely neutral, which meant Voss had learned after 4 years of watching her work that she was satisfied. The agreement was signed in the same hall of voices where the ultimatum had been delivered and rejected 4 years, 1 battle, and some very long nights earlier. Admiral Mrak signed for the United Earth Fleet. Commissioner Ajay signed for the Diplomatic Authority. There were ceremonies, speeches, and a reception afterward where the food included items from 17 different species' culinary traditions and where Voss, eating something that a Drell delegate assured her was an acquired taste, found herself standing next to Vethli. The princess, she would not become empress for another 13 years, was taller than Voss remembered. The same compound eyes, the same amber-violet lattice. She had been part of the Dominion's observer delegation throughout the negotiations, a junior role, formally, but one that Voss suspected had been substantially less junior in practice. "You look better than the last time I saw you," Vethli said. "I got some sleep. I read the analysis of the Kessler engagement, the technical monograph, the fleet's own post-action report." She paused. "You knew Ironclad Meridian. Crew would survive before you sent them in." "I thought they'd survive," Voss said. "There's a gap between thought and knew that I try not to paper over. But you calculated it. The pod routes." "Yes. The report says the pod calculations alone took 11 days. I'm a slow calculator." 11 days, Vethli said again. She was quiet for a moment. Her lattice did the thing that Voss had come to recognize over the years. The full spectrum flicker of genuine recalibration. You were planning the ship's survival at the same time you were planning its use as bait. You never use someone as bait without planning their way out. Many commanders have. "Many commanders," Voss said, "are why there are memorial walls in every fleet station I've ever served on." She took a bite of whatever the Drell thing was. It tasted like mineral springs and old metal and something faintly sweet underneath. "You either do the 11 days or you don't send the ship. There isn't a third option that I'm willing to live with." Vethli studied her. The compound eyes worked on a different information processing schedule than human eyes. Where human vision was fast and often inaccurate, Vethkai visual processing was slower and extraordinarily precise. You always felt, when a Vethkai looked at you carefully, like you were being actually seen, in the way that photographs were different from glances. "I have been thinking about what you said. In the gallery. About fear. I've said a lot of things about fear over the years, that the fear doesn't go anywhere, that you work with it. Yeah, I described that to my mother afterward. She was interested." Vethli paused. She said that in 117 years, she had never met a being who described a negative emotional state as a tool. She found it. She used the word Vera Kessa. Fundamental reassessment. "I know the word," Voss said. Ikkel Voss explained it. "What do humans call that?" Vethli asked. "The fundamental reassessment. When a belief you have held as foundational is shown to be wrong." Voss thought about it. "We have a few words for it. Depends on the context and how long it takes." She paused. "The one that I think fits best for the kind of reassessment where you find out you've been wrong about something that matters." We call it learning. The Galactic Council expanded its charter 6 years after the armistice, incorporating for the first time a formal security architecture clause, a provision that required member civilizations to give advance notice of military deployments beyond their own home systems, and to submit blockade actions to a council review process before implementation. The clause was proposed jointly by the Drell delegation and the Mailer sovereignty, and it passed by a margin that surprised almost everyone except Ikkel Voss, who had been predicting it for 2 years. The clause was, in structural terms, a direct consequence of the Outer Reach War. Every species that had watched the 3-year siege had updated something, updated their models of human behavior, or their models of Vethkai strategy, or their models of what the Council was actually for. The Security Architecture Clause was the Council's collective way of updating its model of what it was supposed to prevent. Voss had been on the working group that drafted it. She had spent 8 months in rooms with representatives of 11 different species, arguing about definitions and thresholds and enforcement mechanisms. And she had learned, in those 8 months, something that she had only abstractly understood before, that the galaxy was not, despite all appearances, primarily organized around power. It was organized around the management of uncertainty. Every treaty, every council session, every diplomatic protocol, all of it was, at its foundation, an attempt by beings of radically different biologies and histories and cognitive architectures to make the future slightly more predictable than the past. She had grown up on a station where you learned to tell the difference between a pressure seal failing and a thermal pipe groaning. The galaxy, she thought, was the same exercise at scale. You learned the systems, you learned what the different sounds meant. You accepted that some of them were going to fail and planned accordingly. You didn't pretend the uncertainty away. You built your knowledge around it. The Security Architecture Clause passed on a Tuesday, or what was marked as Tuesday on the universal calendar that Crosspoint Station used. It was not Tuesday anywhere in particular, but some human on the station's original construction crew had anchored the calendar to Earth standard, and it had never been changed. And so, across the Hall of Voices, as the vote was recorded and the count came in, it was officially Tuesday, which struck Voss as extremely human, in a way she found difficult to explain and completely correct. She was in her office when the message came. 4 months after the charter vote, one of those routine late evening stretches where she had been planning to stop working, and had instead been working for 2 more hours, because there was always more work. The message was from Callaway Station, not official, personal, her mother. Her mother was 71 and had lived on Callaway her entire life, and had never, in Voss's memory, initiated a message with the phrase, "I just wanted to tell you," which was how this one began. The message was 3 minutes long and said nothing in particular. How the station was doing, how the new supply schedules had changed things, how the children who had been born during the blockade were now 6 and 7 years old and were in school. How one of them, a girl named for her grandmother, had apparently told her teacher that she wanted to be in the fleet when she grew up, and the teacher had asked why, and the girl had said, "Because they're the ones who came back. Because they're the ones who came back." Voss sat with that for a while. She thought about all the things she had learned, in the years since the Kessler engagement, about what it meant to fight for something, not the tactics. The tactics were teachable, were being taught, were part of the curriculum at 8 military academies across 4 species now. The tactics were the easy part, in retrospect. What was harder to teach, harder to name, was the thing underneath, the specific quality of a mind that looks at the full scope of the damage done to it and does not collapse inward, but expands outward, not in denial, but in that old determined curious response. The question that was apparently encoded somewhere deeper than language. Right. Now what? She wrote back to her mother. She said the station sounded good. She said she was glad about the children. She said she would try to visit. She probably would not visit this year, but she meant the eventually visit, the real intention that was not yet a plan but was already a direction. And her mother would know that, because her mother had been understanding the difference between those things for 71 years. She sent it. She looked at her notes for the next morning's meeting. She made 2 additions and a correction. She made coffee. She thought about nothing that was particularly important and everything that mattered. The stars outside her office window were the stars of the Kessler expanse. She had requested this posting, the orbital platform that managed the survey work, specifically because she knew this view. The pale blues and ash greens of the nebula, the bruise color of something that had been hit and was deciding whether it would survive. It had decided. Every time, it had decided. She drank her coffee. The stars hung in their old arrangements, and the station hummed with the specific vibration of a human-built structure doing the work it was built to do. And somewhere on a station 3 light hours away, a 6-year-old girl who had been born into a blockade was in school, learning whatever it is that 6-year-olds learn, which is mostly how the world works and what they want to do in it, and she wanted to be in the fleet because they were the ones who came back. Voss set down her cup. She had a meeting in the morning. She had always had a meeting in the morning. She would be there. The final report of the Outer Reach War Commission, submitted to the Galactic Council's archive 8 years after the armistice, concluded with a section that was unusual for a formal archival document, a set of questions the Commission considered unresolved and recommended for ongoing study. The last of these questions read, "Human civilization has demonstrated, across its documented history and most recently in the events of the Outer Reach period, a consistent capacity to absorb catastrophic loss and reconstitute functional civilization. The mechanism underlying this capacity is imperfectly understood. Current models attribute it variously to biological factors, cortisol, adrenaline, response profile, endurance metabolism, cognitive factors, memory and narrative consolidation, distributed social learning, and cultural factors, preserved historical record, cross-generational knowledge transfer. None of these models, individually or in combination, fully accounts for the observed behavior. The Commission recommends continued study, with the acknowledgement that a complete model may require conceptual frameworks not yet developed." The document was stamped, filed, and distributed. It entered the archive. Somewhere on Callaway Station in the Kessler Expanse, the air still tasted slightly of metal. The gravity was still 0, ZO3G too low. The children born during the blockade were growing up the way children grow up everywhere, in the specific texture of the world they were given, learning its sounds, learning what the different vibrations meant, learning to tell the difference between things that were dangerous and things that only felt dangerous, and carrying forward, in the way that living things carry things forward, everything that had come before. And on a survey platform above the pale blue and ash-green light of a nebula that looked like bruises healing, a fleet commander sat in her office at the end of a long day, with a cup of coffee and a view she had chosen on purpose, and was afraid and working and present and alive. All of those things at once, all of them true, the way they had always been true, the way they would keep being true for as long as humans had been humans and were still deciding, every day and in every possible language, to be here, to keep going, to find out what came next. There is a thing that happens in the Kessler Expanse in the deep of the local night cycle, when the survey platforms power down their active scanning and run on passive instruments alone, and the only lights are the navigation beacons and the pale bioluminescent edge glow of the nebula itself. The platform crew calls it the Quiet Watch, not a formal designation, just the name that had accumulated over the years the way names accumulate in places where people spend long stretches of time together. Someone on the original survey crew had called it that, and it had stuck, the way things stick when they're exactly right. Voss had worked the Quiet Watch 3 times in her months on the platform. Not because she was required to. Her rank exempted her from rotation, but because she found that the specific quality of attention required by passive monitoring was useful to her in a way she had trouble explaining precisely. You weren't looking for anything in particular. You were receptive to whatever was there. You held the possibility of signal without demanding it. The 3rd time she worked it, there was a signal, not an emergency signal, not a military contact, a communication pulse on the diplomatic channel, encrypted, addressed to her personally from a sender code she had been given years ago and had not used in some time. She ran the decryption and found, on the other side of it, a message from Vethli, the princess, Empress designate now, with her mother's health declining in the way that Vethkai health declined over centuries, slowly and with full awareness of the arc, had sent a brief text message in Galactic Standard rather than Vethkai, which meant she was being careful about who might read it in transit. The message read, "My mother has asked me to tell you something. She believes you will understand it better than anyone else she could sense it to. She says, in 117 years, she has been wrong about many things. She has corrected most of them. The correction of this one may be the most important work she has done. She thanks you for the information that made it possible. She does not expect a reply. She wanted it said. Vethly. Voss read the message twice. She sat for a moment in the quiet watch, with the pale blue-green light of the Kessler Expanse on the forward viewport, and the navigation beacons blinking their slow, patient signals into the dark. A ruler of 117 years. An empire that had held 41 stations in 6 worlds and thought it understood what it was doing. A strategy that had not failed so much as encountered a category of resistance it had not accounted for, and an intelligence great enough, after the fact, to identify the gap precisely and name it without excuse. The correction of this one may be the most important work she has done. Voss thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it cost, after a century of being certain, to find a thing you had been wrong about and do the work of correcting it, not by minimizing it, but by looking at it fully, in the way that you had to look at things if you wanted to actually understand them. She thought about Ikkel Voss and his ongoing project of finding the right words for things that didn't have them yet. She thought about Commissioner Adjei spending 40 years learning a language before she needed it. She thought about a 6-year-old girl on Callaway Station who wanted to be in the fleet because they were the ones who came back and didn't know yet what that meant in full, and would spend a life learning it the same way everyone learned the things that mattered, slowly, through experience, in the company of other people who were also learning. She drafted a reply. Thank her crystalline exactitude for the message. Tell her that the information was freely given, and that the work she has done with it is her own. Also, the coffee here is good. If there is ever a Vethkai diplomatic mission that passes through the Kessler Expanse, we will make some. She sent it. She went back to the quiet watch. The nebula pulsed slowly in the colors of something old and enormous that had taken a hit long ago and was, by every available measure, doing fine. The years accumulated the way years do, unevenly, with the weight falling in unexpected places and the light falling in others. The commission work concluded. The charter amendments stood. The security architecture clause was tested 3 times in the following decade, once by a Malir territorial action in the outer belt that was halted before it began, once by a Vethkai survey fleet that crossed a boundary by 40,000 kilometers, and then corrected course without incident, and once by something that was never fully classified, but that involved a deep space monitoring station near the edge of known space, and a Keth-Dur response time that suggested to everyone who examined the data that the ancient sleeping builders of the deep had been watching the last decade rather more carefully than they had previously acknowledged. Humanity, in those years, built, not in the explosive way of early expansion that had been tempered by the war, by the specific education of learning how fragile supply lines were and how much the outer colonies depended on the inner systems maintaining the political will to maintain them. The building was more deliberate now, more considered. Stations were built with better margins, better redundancy, better connections to the network. Colony worlds were supported with longer-term supply agreements. The fleet was rebuilt with a different doctrine, not the defensive posture of the pre-war years which had left them always responding, but something more active. A monitoring and presence strategy that put human ships at more junctions in the galactic network, not as a threat, but as a fact on the ground. A visible declaration that human interests extended this far and that human awareness extended farther. Ikkel Voss, now fully retired and writing a book that he had been drafting notes for since the year of the armistice, told Voss that this was the most significant change. Not the tactical innovations, not the diplomatic framework, but the shift in what humans understood about their own presence in the galaxy. Before the war, he said, over tea in his study on Crosspoint Station, he had decided to simply stay. After 37 years, he considered himself a permanent resident. Your collective self-image was of a young species finding its place, uncertain of the scale of your own relevance. After the war, that changed. Not into arrogance. You have some individuals who moved toward arrogance, but the collective did not. What changed was the certainty. You became certain that you belonged here, that your presence mattered, that what you built was worth defending, and what you lost was worth grieving, and what you might build still was worth working toward. He sipped his tea. This is, I believe, what your species calls growing up. It is interesting to watch. You're one of the most condescending beings I've ever liked, Voss said. I am a Malir. We are constitutionally incapable of condescension. What you perceive as condescension is simply the natural result of being several hundred years older than you. That's extremely condescending. Yes, he agreed. It is. The book he had been drafting was published 4 years later, in Galactic Standard, with translations into 31 languages released simultaneously, a first for a work of xenosociological analysis, and achieved, his publisher noted, because pre-orders had come in from 11 different species before the final manuscript was even submitted. The title was, characteristically long and precise, The Architecture of Return, Human Civilization and the Question of Irreducible Minimum. The subtitle was, characteristically, the more interesting part. What the galaxy did not know it did not know. The chapter that was most widely reprinted and discussed, the one that ended up in curricula on 6 worlds and was cited in 47 subsequent papers, was the 5th, titled simply, The Floor. It was not a military analysis or a political analysis. It was a philosophical argument, careful and densely sourced, about the difference between a species whose minimum viable state was high and a species whose minimum viable state was very nearly nothing. Voss argued that the galaxy's major civilizations had, largely without discussion, structured their threat models around the assumption that all intelligent life had roughly equivalent minimum viable states. Equivalent, that is, in the sense that you could predict the threshold at which a civilization would recognize defeat and cease to function as a political entity. This assumption was reasonable if you were comparing species with similar developmental histories. It was completely inapplicable to humanity, which had spent 1 million years evolving in conditions that had, repeatedly and without apology, taken the population down to numbers where civilizational continuity by any ordinary definition was impossible, and from which the population had rebuilt each time. He wrote, "The question is not why humanity did not fold under the blockade. The question, which we failed to ask for 3 years while the data was in front of us, is what would it take for them to fold? The answer, as best I can determine from the historical record, is more than any civilization in their region of the galaxy is capable of delivering. This is not a boast. It is a structural observation. The floor has been tested catastrophically at least 15 times in the recorded developmental history. Each time the floor held. Each time, what came back was recognizably continuous with what had been there before, not identical, not unchanged, but continuous. The same thread. The same, and here I am forced to use a word I normally avoid as too imprecise, the same spirit." He concluded the chapter. We were trying to win a war against a civilization by taking away their reasons to continue. We had not understood, none of us had understood, that the reasons to continue were not external. They were not in the supply lines, or the territorial integrity, or the economic viability of the outer reach. They were in something internal and distributed, and, as far as I can determine after a decade of study, functionally ineradicable. You cannot take away the reasons to continue from a species that learned, at a cellular level, before it had language, that the act of continuing was itself the reason. The memorial on Callaway Station was small. Everything on Callaway was small, space being what it was, and it listed the names of everyone from the station who had served in the Outer Reach War and not come home. There were 19 of them. It also listed, below a dividing line, the names of everyone who had been on the station when the blockade began and who had not survived to see the end of it. There were 7, supply-related illness, 1 accident, 2 who had simply not had the biological reserves to weather 3 years of rationing. Voss had been to the memorial twice. The first time was shortly after the armistice, on the supply convoy run that had routed her through Callaway and into that cafeteria and that hour of coffee and watching children run. The second time was on the visit she had promised her mother, 2 years after the promise, which was better than she had expected when she made it. Her mother was in reasonable health, for 73. She had the slightly indefinite quality of someone who had spent decades adapting to whatever conditions presented themselves, which meant she had become extraordinarily competent at a lot of things that weren't technically her job, because her job was station administration, and station administration on Callaway was essentially everything. She and Voss sat in the same cafeteria, at a table that Voss was fairly sure was the same table as the first visit, and had coffee that was still better than it used to be, because the new supply agreements had made Earth Standard grounds available on a regular schedule now. "You look different," her mother said. "Different how? Like you know what you're doing." "I've always known what I was doing." "No," her mother said. with the specific accuracy of someone who had been watching you since before you knew how to walk. You always knew how to do what you were doing. That's different. For a long time you were very competent and also very alone in it. Like you were doing the work and also carrying the awareness that you were the one who had to do it. And no one else understood the weight of that. She sipped her coffee. Now you look like you found some people who understand. Voss thought about Ickel Voss and his tea and his book. She thought about Commissioner Adjay and her 40 years of preparation. She thought about Vethley, who was now Empress-in-waiting and who sent her a message on her birthday. Earth Standard. Every year, brief and formal. Because Vethley was formal in the way that people who have learned to be careful about the power they carry are formal, but consistent in the way of someone for whom consistency was a form of respect. I did, she said. Her mother nodded. She looked satisfied in the way that mothers who have spent a long time worrying about something look when they have been given permission to stop. They sat for a while. The station hummed with its usual vibrations. The air tasted of metal. The gravity was still slightly off. Outside the viewport, the Kessler Expanse hung in its old colors, blue and ash green, patient as geological time, vast and entirely indifferent and exactly as it had always been. Exactly as it had always been, and they were here in it, which was all it had ever taken. To be here, to come back. The story that Voss told, in the years after, in briefing rooms and commission meetings and, eventually, the commencement address, and in conversations over tea or coffee in the observation galleries and cafeterias of a dozen stations across the expanse, was not the story she would have told at the beginning. At the beginning, she would have told the story as a military narrative, the strategy, the execution, the result, the technical problem and the technical solution. This was a true story, and it was a good story, and it was not the whole story. The whole story was that 18 billion people had been afraid for 3 years. Afraid for their families in the outer reach, afraid of what the blockade meant for humanity's position in the galaxy, afraid, if they were honest, and many of them were, in the specific way that honest people are honest about fears when there's nothing else to do but be honest. Afraid that the Empress was right, that the math was what it appeared to be, that the strategic position was what it appeared to be, and that the right thing to do was to find the most dignified possible version of giving in. 18 billion people had been afraid, and they had not given in, and it was not because they were brave. It was because somewhere underneath the fear, there was something older. Something that did not use language and did not make arguments, but that operated constantly and without consultation, like a pressure seal holding against vacuum. Just this, just the holding, just the maintenance of the thing that needed to be maintained. Just the refusal to accept that this moment was the final moment, because there was always, somehow, a next one. This was the thing no model had captured and no report had fully named. Not courage, not stubbornness, not even resilience exactly, though that came closest. It was something more fundamental, the specific and apparently ineradicable tendency of a species shaped by 10,000 catastrophes to understand at a level below cognition that this is not the end. Not as optimism, not as denial, but as a structural feature of consciousness. A default assumption baked into the biology by a million years of surviving things that should not have been survived. The Empress had tried to remove the reasons to continue. She had not understood that for humans, the continuation was itself the reason. This was what Voss had said at the council table 3 years into the war, and what she had been unable to fully explain because it was not, finally, a logical argument, was a description of a fact. The fact was human life, ongoing, stubborn, afraid and working, taking the damage and assessing the damage, and asking the only question that had ever mattered. Right, now what? The stars held their positions above the Kessler Expanse. The stations kept its recycled air and its slightly low gravity and its metallic smell and its children growing up into whatever they would become. The galaxy turned in its long, slow cycles, ancient and various and full of civilizations doing the same fundamental work, trying to understand the things they didn't understand, trying to survive the things that threatened their survival, trying to make from the raw material of existence something that would last beyond the moment. Humanity was not the oldest at this work, not the wisest, not the strongest, just perhaps the most practiced, and still here, still going.